is have you all write your responses like you did, and then you all would exchange your papers, and we go over all the answers and grade the paper and grade the papers. Now, it wouldn't count for an actual grade. What it's meant to show is that if we consider ourselves experts in a subject, we can still get a wide variety of opinions on a certain subject, even as experts. Okay, so some of y'all would have had very varied answers. Um, Again, showcasing the idea that experts can have very different opinions or thoughts on a specific topic. And so as a result, we want to make sure that when we post something in science, whether it's a new publication or new paper, we want the most accurate results posted. We don't just want a mixed bag of opinions. Okay, so what we need to have is a consensus upon a consensus among experts when we send out this data or this publication. Okay, so the process that we do in order to prevent varied responses from falling through or keep incorrect information from falling through. Like some of y'all may have had incorrect responses yesterday. Again, that's no big deal. I wasn't grading for accuracy. Some of the questions may not have known. But the idea is to prevent inaccurate information from falling through. We have this process we call peer review in order to prevent inaccurate information from falling through. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. Okay? So what we're up to today. How do scientists prevent falsified or tainted research from reaching the public? How can we ensure that experimental data is accurate and not mistaken / made up? Okay. Again, there's nothing wrong with mistaken data. It happens. There's errors at times, but we don't want that. We don't want that to get through to the mainstream. And then on other times, we can have the completely horrible case of somebody just making up data, as we'll see later on this lesson. All right. And then this is what we were going to start with if we were doing this in class, but unfortunately we're not in class, okay? So the reason why peer review is so important is we need to go ahead and be able to prevent inaccurate information, like again, information that's perhaps from a lab that had certain errors in it, or we need to prevent falsified information from reaching the public, okay? So again, the big reason for this why is the whole anti-vaccination movement was started by a paper that contained falsified data back in 1988 that linked autism to the MMR vaccine, which is more commonly known as the measles vaccine. Okay, measles, mumps, or rubella, hence MMR. Okay, so we need a rigorous process through which we can check the work, check this work in order to prevent inaccurate or falsified information from reaching the public, which can have very dangerous consequences, as we've already seen, and as we'll explore in more detail down the line in this unit. So peer review, it's kind of like the jury. It's kind of like the judge and jury for science, okay? The idea is that peer review is a process by which scientific research on a particular field is checked by other experts in that field. Hence, this is why we call it peer review, because the research is being reviewed or checked. And who are the people who are reviewing or checking the research? Other experts in the field, hence your peers in that field, okay? So the goal here is with peer review is that if you post a paper that may contain an error or contain a typo, or even if you're like the guy who posted the vaccines paper, posting completely falsified evidence, the idea is that your peers in the scientific community can look over your work for you in order to make sure it's accurate, in order to make sure that there's no errors, in order to make sure that if you're trying to falsify data, that the data is not falsified. So it's kind of like a checks and balances kind of sort of that we have, to use a phrase from government and civics, okay? In peer review, the paper is open to be evaluated by all in that field to prevent personal biases. So not just your close friends. In fact, if you're your close friends, that may actually not be a good thing, but it's open to be evaluated by all in the scientific community. So people who you don't even know can look over your work and tell you whether or not it's accurate. And this is actually preferred because if a person does not know you, then they have no personal biases against you, meaning, oh, I don't like that guy. I think his ideas are crazy, so I'm just going to automatically throw his paper out. Or, oh, I really like this guy. He does a lot for the field, so his paper is accurate. I'm going to say his paper is accurate. So by having evaluated by people in the fields who don't even know you, we can prevent personal biases from leaking into our judgments and leaking into the evaluation of the paper. And again, like I said, this is like a checks and balances. It's kind of like grammar checking in English. It prevents holes in the research and logic, except instead of looking out for grammatical issues, you're looking out for scientific issues. Does this theory make sense? Does the math add up? Is this something that we would expect to happen based on what we already know, so on and so forth? So the process of peer review prevents holes in research and in the research and logic of certain scientists' works. Again, if you have any questions or you need more time for notes, just post it in the chat. All right, so if there's no questions, we'll move on to the next slide. Recreation of experiments. All right, so sometimes faulty or errant papers do slip through the cracks. The science is sound, but the data is unchecked. The reason being, again, is that you can have experimental errors, which is totally reasonable happen. It's not, I mean, it is a bad thing, but it's not an intentional thing. So it's not something wrong with the scientist. The scientist isn't doing anything wrong. It's just that something went wrong in the process of carrying out the lab. So to check for this, the simplest way to check to see if the data is correct is to recreate the experiment and see if you get the same results. So you may have done this in prior science classes, where you go ahead and you do multiple trials for a certain experiment in order to ensure your data is consistent. Okay, so by doing so, you can look at all your trials and say, my data is consistent across all my trials. I get the same numbers each and every time, or right around the same numbers. So that tells me that this lab has been done accurately. If you notice that one trial contains numbers that are skewed or way off, that'll tell you that that one trial probably has an error with it, even though I don't know what the error is. Because the numbers are way off, that tells me there's an error there, and you can remove that trial from your data. Okay, so by recreating the experiment, we can see if we get the same results in order to see if our data is accurate and correct. Again, incorrect research does not necessarily mean unethical research, aka if your data is incorrect, it doesn't mean that you're lying or that you're doing things that are unethical or bad. It could mean that there's an error again in the lab, or part of science is discovering new data that changes what we know. That's part of the fun of science is sometimes you do an experiment, multiple trials, and you get numbers that don't add up with what is currently known in science. And that tells you that that kind of opens the doorway for new discoveries in science. So for example, I'll give you all an example here, and I should actually add this in a slide for next year or for next round of classes. The old theory of gravity was based off Isaac Newton's works back in the 1600s, which actually did very well to explain the orbits of planets around the sun. However, there was data collected on one planet that orbited the sun, specifically Mercury, that did not line up exactly with Isaac Newton's predictions. So what this showed is it didn't show that Isaac Newton's research was incorrect or that Isaac Newton was making stuff up. It showed that there was new data that opened the door for changing what was currently known. And so this paved the way for new discoveries about how gravity works for about 400 years. So 400 years later, in 1900, or about 300 years later, excuse me, in 1900, Albert Einstein came along and produced a new theory that did produce the correct results. So again, incorrect research does not necessarily mean unethical research. It's just part of the process of discovering new data in order to open new doors for research. All right, so do we need any more time to get any of this stuff down right here? All right. So, um, so an example of research that was inaccurate but not unethical is what's known as cold fusion, if you haven't heard of it before, okay? So essentially, the idea behind fusion in physics is you take atoms or you take subatomic particles that make up atoms like protons and neutrons, and you collide them and you fuse them together. You join them together, hence why we say fusion. In doing so, a large amount of energy is released, except the only problem is that you can only do it in very, very, very high temperature environments, okay? Like in nuclear reactors. So that requires a lot of money, it's very inefficient, and it's also a little bit unsafe. There are accidents, as we'll explore down the line in this unit, okay? So one hypothetical solution to this is what's known as cold fusion, where nuclear fusion reactions take place in at room temperature, okay? So back in the, I forget what time span it was, I think it's in the 1980s, two scientists by names of Pons and Fleischmann conducted a cold fusion test experiment where they placed what's known as a cathode and anode. Essentially, they're the wires that connect to a battery in room temperature water, okay? I'm not going to go over the whole details of the experiment, but what they saw through the experiment was that experiment produced a huge amount of energy, so much so that they saw fusion as the only explanation. However, neither the number of neutrons nor the amount of gamma radiation measured matched the expectations expected generated by nuclear theory, okay? And Pons and Fleischmann didn't actually initially check to see if their experiment had produced any helium, okay? These are all kind of hallmarks of nuclear fusion. If you're not aware of what nuclear fusion is or the hallmarks of nuclear fusion, you don't have to worry about the science details. The big point here is that it seemed like a big breakthrough had happened, that they could produce a large amount of energy from nuclear fusion at room temperature. However, what was done is, however, in order to test this out, numerous experiments that recreated this experiment right here were conducted, and they found out that the measurements in this experiment were inconsistent with the idea of cold fusion, okay? In addition, another research group performed similar experiments that found conflicting results, okay? So as a result, by recreating this experiment right here, we could see that the data that this initial scientist had collected on their initial experiment was inaccurate, and thus what was actually happening, or what they thought was happening, was not what was actually happening, okay? So it wasn't that these scientists, Pons and Fleischmann, did anything wrong. It wasn't that they were falsifying their data. It's just that there were experimental errors in their results. Again, that happens. So by recreating this experiment, scientists were able to collect additional data and compare that additional data to the results from the initial experiment, and use that to say, okay, the results don't line up with the initial experiment, so something must have been wrong with the initial experiment. So as a result, Pons and Fleischmann realized that their results were inaccurate. So that's the benefit of testing out an experiment multiple times, is seeing that, oh, okay, they've tested it out again. The data doesn't match up with what we found, so maybe there was an error in how we conducted our experiment. All right, so another way that you can check to see if a scientific paper is accurate or not, okay, is to check your scientific sources, okay? Scientific papers will contain sources at the end, kind of like if you've written a paper in English, how you cite sources at the end of an English paper, okay? So what you can do is, if you're wondering if a scientific article is accurate or not, you can actually check scientific sources to see if the resources that come up are credible, okay? So we'll go over how to determine if a source is credible or not down the line in this unit. Again, we're not going to throw too much. I'm not going to throw too much at y'all right now. We're just going to introduce the topics gradually. So the idea is that by checking sources, you can see if a certain result is accurate or not. So here's, like, for example, a source that comes up for cold fusion. Cold fusion now. All right, we can see that it looks like an accurate paper. It looks like a post, but we can actually, it looks like a pretty accurate post. But what we can see right here is that this is actually just a common blog post, we have all these blogs being posted right here. We We have podcasts and videos, okay? And we can also see that this is not posted by a .edu site, okay? So typically, and we'll see this down the line in this unit, is that if you have a .edu site, that tends to be indicative of an accurate source because it means it's coming, where am I? Where am I? I get so lost here. So many tabs open. It means that we're coming from a college website or a research website that has a .edu, .edu being short for education, okay? Now, this guy just has a blog post up, which seems trustworthy, but the thing to consider, and again, this is something we'll look at down the line in this unit, is that any single person can create a blog post and post whatever they want, okay? So something like this is not very accurate because anybody can create a blog post and post what they want. So that's what we'll go over down the line in this unit. So scientific sources. In a nutshell, we'll go over what scientific sources are right now and how to distinguish between them, and then we'll go into more detail in a separate unit, or excuse me, separate lesson within this unit. So we are going to have a project at the end of this unit, so you can start looking at scientific sources like the ones I have posted here for your project. So here are some reputable scientific sources that should be used in reports/projects. Please get these down if you don't have them. Scientific American, Quantum Magazine, and Science Magazine, NASA, Science Foundation, National Science Foundation, American Mathematical Society, and the National Institute of Health. And then also university websites, again, domains ending in .edu are very trustworthy, okay? Scientific American, Quantum Magazine, and Science Magazine are all magazines that report on the latest advances in all domains of science, by all branches of science, biology, chemistry, physics, and mathematics, okay? Mathematics isn't science, but it gets thrown in there because mathematics is very important to the advancement of science. So all three of these take all of the current research in modern science and present and condense them down and present them for people to read about. So these are excellent sources to keep abreast of current scientific development, okay? NASA, obviously the National Aerospace Agency is very trustworthy. That's a government branch that conducts research in science. The National Science Foundation is another government branch that provides funding for scientific projects and scientific research. So it's also another trustworthy resource. The American Mathematical Society posts latest advancements in mathematics, okay? And then National Institute of Health, and this is really important right now, they post all the latest research on medical advancements, on biological advancements, biomedical advancements, so on and so forth. So National Institute of Health is actually very important right now because they're because along with the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, they're responsible for conducting research and publishing this research to the public on the current predicament faced by the COVID-19 pandemic, okay? So again, please make sure you have each of these written down right here, all these resources. If you need more time, which I'm anticipating we'll need, please post in the chat, okay? All right, so I'm not seeing any questions popping up. Ningunas preguntas, as they say in Spanish, como se dice en español. Or if you're speaking Portuguese, como se diz no português, também. All right, let's see here. Oh, and I think we've actually reached the end of our slideshow here. Awesome, 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 awesome. So yeah, there is nothing else I have to report here. This is our lesson for today. We'll go into more detail, specifically some really interesting cases where we see science has been used in some really messed up cases, where science has been abused, and look at the ethics of science down the line in this unit. So we're going to start looking at how we can apply this information to actual real-world examples that have actually happened, and also maybe look within the context of the current ongoing pandemic. All right. So that's all I have to say. This is the lesson for today. If you have any questions, you can post them in the chat. If there are no questions, you are free to go for today.